When the lawyer finished reading Robert's will that cold Tuesday morning in February, every single person in that mahogany-paneled conference room turned and stared directly at me. Not the sympathetic looks you'd expect for a grieving widow, not the polite acknowledgement you give someone who just inherited their husband's estate. These were looks of shock, confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to accusation. Because according to the document that lawyer held in his trembling hands, my husband of 15 years, the man I'd loved, supported, and mourned, had left me absolutely nothing, and apparently, I wasn't the only Mrs. Robert Johnson in the room. My name is Moniqua Johnson, and until 3 weeks ago, I was living what I thought was a blessed life in Memphis with my husband Robert and our twin boys, Marcus and Michael, who just turned 12. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent the last 15 years building what I believed was a beautiful marriage based on love, trust, and shared dreams. I grew up in a house where love was loud and messy and wonderful. My mama, Dolores, worked double shifts at the hospital, but she still managed to have dinner on the table every night at 6 o'clock sharp. Sunday mornings meant Mama's famous buttermilk pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse heads, and Sunday evenings meant the whole extended family crammed into our tiny living room, playing dominoes and arguing about everything from sports to politics, while the smell of her pot roast filled the house. Mama taught me that marriage was about showing up every day, even when you didn't feel like it. Love isn't just a feeling, baby girl, she'd tell me while braiding my hair before school. Love is a choice you make over and over again, especially when life gets hard. That's the kind of love I thought I'd found with Robert. We met at a church barbecue when I was 23 and fresh out of nursing school. He was 28, working as a project manager for a construction company, with the kind of smile that could light up a room and a laugh that made you want to join in, even when you didn't know what was funny. Robert had this way of making everyone around him feel special, like they were the most important person in his world. Our courtship was old-fashioned and sweet. He'd bring me flowers every Friday. Not expensive roses, but whatever was blooming in his landlady Mrs. Patterson's garden, always with a little note tucked between the stems. Thought these were beautiful, but not as beautiful as you. Or, these made me smile, just like you do every day. When he proposed, it was during one of Mama's Sunday dinners, right there in front of God and everybody, getting down on one knee beside the dining room table, while my cousin Jerome was still arguing with Uncle Tony about the Lakers game. The ring was modest, a simple solitaire that he'd saved 6 months to buy, but I cried like he'd given me the crown jewels. Our wedding was perfect in all the ways that matter. We didn't have much money, so the reception was in the church fellowship hall with decorations my girlfriends and I had made by hand. But when Robert and I had our first dance to Luther Vandross, singing Here and Now, surrounded by everyone we loved, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The early years of our marriage were everything I'd dreamed of. We rented a small apartment near downtown Memphis, and I'd pack Robert's lunch every morning before my shift at the hospital, while he made coffee for both of us. We'd sit at our little kitchen table, planning our future over toast and eggs, talking about the house we'd buy, the children we'd have, the life we'd build together. When I got pregnant with the twins, Robert was over the moon. He'd talk to my belly every night, reading stories and playing music, convinced he could give them a head start on loving books and jazz. These boys are going to be something special, he'd say, and I believed him completely. Marcus and Michael arrived 6 weeks early, tiny and perfect and absolutely exhausting. Those first few months were a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleep deprivation. But Robert stepped up in ways that made me fall in love with him all over again. He'd get up for the 2 a.m. feeding without complaint, singing old Motown songs in his deep voice while rocking whichever baby was fussing. We managed to buy our house when the boys were 3, a modest 3-bedroom in a family-friendly neighborhood with good schools and a big backyard perfect for childhood adventures. I'll never forget the day we got the keys. Robert picked me up and spun me around right there on the front porch, while the boys squealed with delight. "This is it, Moniqua," he said, his eyes bright with pride and possibility. "This is where we build our legacy." And build we did. Family barbecues in the backyard every summer, elaborate birthday parties where Robert would spend weeks planning treasure hunts and games for the boys and their friends. Christmas mornings where our living room looked like a toy store explosion. Robert was the kind of father who never missed a Little League game, who helped with homework every night, who made sure the boys knew they were loved and supported and capable of achieving anything they set their minds to. For 15 years, our life felt solid, predictable in the best way. Robert would leave for work every morning at 7:30, kissing me goodbye and telling the boys to mind their mama. He'd come home around 6, tired, but always ready to help with dinner or homework, or whatever chaos our household had generated that day. We had our routines, our traditions, our little inside jokes that made us feel like we were part of something bigger than ourselves. Friday nights were movie nights, Saturday mornings were pancake breakfasts, and Sunday evenings were family walks around the neighborhood, waving to neighbors and dreaming out loud about renovations we'd make to the house or vacations we'd take when money wasn't so tight. I thought I knew everything about the man I'd married. I thought our life together was an open book, built on honesty and shared values and the kind of love that only gets stronger with time. I was wrong about everything. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that started forming about 2 years ago. Subtle changes in Robert's behavior that I explained away because I trusted him completely. The first thing I noticed was his phone. Robert had never been secretive about his phone. He'd leave it lying around, answer calls in front of me, even hand it to me sometimes to look up directions or check the weather. But suddenly, he started keeping it face down during dinner, taking it with him to the bathroom, even sleeping with it on his nightstand instead of charging it in the kitchen like he always had. When I mentioned it, he brushed me off with a laugh. "Work's been crazy lately, baby. You know how clients are. They think I'm available 24/7. It made sense on the surface. Robert's construction business had been growing, and he'd always been dedicated to his clients. But something about the way he guarded that phone made my stomach clench with unease I couldn't name. Then there were the weekend trips. Robert started having to travel for work more often. Site visits in Nashville, client meetings in Little Rock, conferences in Atlanta. Always somewhere within driving distance. Always just for the weekend. Always with explanations that sounded perfectly reasonable. "I hate leaving you with the boys," he'd say, kissing my forehead as he loaded his overnight bag into the car. But this Johnson project could be huge for us, worth the sacrifice. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was unthinkable. Robert had never lied to me about anything important. Why would he start now? But the boys noticed the change, too. "Why does Daddy go away so much now?" Marcus asked one Saturday morning after Robert had left for another client meeting. "Daddy's working hard so we can have nice things," I told him. But the words felt hollow, even as I said them. Money became strange around that time. We'd always managed our finances together, both our names on the accounts, both of us knowing exactly what came in and what went out. But Robert started handling more of the bills alone, claiming he wanted to take the burden off me so I could focus on the boys and my job at the hospital. "You work hard enough, Moniqua," he said when I asked to see our bank statements. "Let me handle the boring stuff." It should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like exclusion. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't know exactly where we stood financially, and that uncertainty made me nervous in ways I couldn't articulate. The phone calls started coming to the house phone, something that hadn't happened in years since everyone used cell phones. But suddenly people were calling our landline asking for Robert, and when I'd offer to take a message, they'd hang up without saying anything. "Probably just solicitors," Robert said when I mentioned it, but his jaw tightened in a way that told me he was lying. The worst part was how Robert started looking at me. Not with the warm love I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of marriage, but with something that looked almost like guilt. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me across the dinner table, and when our eyes met, he'd quickly look away, like he couldn't bear to hold my gaze. 3 months before Robert passed away, he started talking about life insurance and wills, subjects that had never come up in our marriage despite having 2 children. "We need to get our affairs in order, Moniqua," he said one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner. "Make sure you and the boys are taken care of if something happens to me." "Nothing's going to happen to you," I said, but his intensity about the subject made me uncomfortable. "We're both young and healthy. There's plenty of time for that stuff. You never know what life's going to throw at you," he insisted. "I need to know my family is protected." He made an appointment with a lawyer the following week, claiming he wanted to set up a simple will and increase his life insurance policy. It seemed responsible, mature, the kind of thing good fathers and husbands did. I had no idea he was setting up the foundation for the most devastating betrayal of my life. The last month of Robert's life was filled with moments that now seem like warnings I was too trusting to recognize. He'd hug me longer than usual, tell me he loved me with an intensity that felt desperate rather than romantic. He'd stare at the boys while they were doing homework or watching TV, like he was trying to memorize their faces. "You okay, baby?" I'd ask when I'd find him lost in thought. "Just thinking about how blessed I am," he'd say, but there was a sadness in his voice that didn't match his words. 2 weeks before the heart attack, Robert came home from one of his weekend trips looking exhausted and stressed in a way I'd never seen before. He barely ate dinner, was short with the boys when they wanted help with a science project, and went to bed without our usual evening conversation. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and found him sitting in the kitchen in the dark, just staring out the window into our backyard. "Robert, what's wrong?" He startled like he'd been caught doing something wrong, then pulled me into a hug that lasted so long the boys would have been embarrassed if they'd seen it. "I love you, Monica," he whispered into my hair. "Whatever happens, remember that I love you and the boys more than life itself." It should have been romantic, but it felt like goodbye. The heart attack came on a Thursday morning while Robert was getting ready for work. One moment he was tying his tie in our bedroom mirror, humming an old Sam Cooke song, and the next moment he was on the floor, clutching his chest, his face gray with pain and terror. "Call 911!" he gasped, and I did, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. The paramedics worked on him for 20 minutes, right there in our bedroom while I stood in the doorway, still in my pajamas, watching the man I loved fight for his life on the carpet where we'd played with the boys as toddlers. Marcus and Michael were getting ready for school downstairs, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. "Ma'am, we're taking him to Methodist Hospital," one of the paramedics said as they loaded Robert onto a stretcher. "You can follow us." I called my neighbor Mrs. Williams to watch the boys and drove to the hospital in a daze, praying harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. But by the time I got to the emergency room, it was too late. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm so sorry," Dr. Martinez said, and I knew from his expression that the worst had happened. "We did everything we could, but the damage to his heart was too extensive." Robert was gone at 38 years old, leaving me a widow with twin 12-year-olds and a future I couldn't imagine navigating alone. The funeral was a blur of flowers and casseroles and people telling me how sorry they were for my loss. Robert's co-workers from the construction company came, along with parents from the boys' school, neighbors, and church members who'd watched our family grow over the years. "He was a good man," everyone kept saying, and I believed them because I believed I'd known Robert completely. The boys handled their father's death the way children do, with a mixture of profound sadness and resilient acceptance that broke my heart. Marcus, the more emotional twin, cried openly during the service. Michael, always the protector, sat between me and his brother, patting my hand whenever the tears became too much. "Daddy's in heaven now, right, Mama?" Michael whispered during the graveside service. Yes, baby, I whispered back. Daddy's with God now. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought we'd begin the long process of healing, of learning to be a family of 3 instead of 4. I had no idea the real devastation was still coming. 2 weeks after the funeral, Robert's lawyer, Mr. Thornton, called to schedule the reading of the will. It seemed like a formality. Robert had told me he'd made a simple will leaving everything to me and the boys. Standard stuff for a young family. Wednesday at 10 a.m., Mr. Thornton said, his voice strangely formal. There will be several beneficiaries present. Several beneficiaries? I asked. I thought it was just me and the boys. Mrs. Johnson, I think it's best if we discuss everything at the meeting. There are complications that need to be addressed in person. Complications. The word sent ice water through my veins, but I couldn't imagine what complications there could be. Robert and I had been married 15 years. We owned our house together, had joint bank accounts, shared everything. What could be complicated about a straightforward inheritance? I arrived at Mr. Thornton's office Wednesday morning, wearing my black funeral dress, because it felt appropriate, because I was still deep in grief and couldn't imagine wearing anything else. The office was in downtown Memphis, all dark wood and leather chairs, the kind of place that smelled like money and important decisions. But when the secretary led me to the conference room, I stopped dead in the doorway. The room wasn't empty as I'd expected. There were other people there, strangers I'd never seen before, all looking as confused and uncomfortable as I felt. An older white woman with perfectly styled gray hair sat at the far end of the conference table, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. Next to her sat a younger black woman, maybe my age, with 2 small children who couldn't have been more than 6 and 8 years old. Across from them was a middle-aged Hispanic man in a work uniform, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mrs. Johnson? Mr. Thornton stood as I entered. Please take a seat. I sat down slowly, my mind racing with questions I couldn't voice. Who were these people? Why were they at my husband's will reading? And why did that woman with the gray hair keep staring at me like she knew something I didn't? Now that everyone's here, Mr. Thornton began, opening a thick folder. We can proceed with the reading of Robert Johnson's last will and testament. The formal words washed over me as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The younger woman with the children looked like she'd been crying. The older woman's neutral expression never changed. The man in the work uniform kept checking his phone, like he had somewhere more important to be. I, Robert Eugene Johnson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The beginning was standard legal language, nothing that gave me any clues about why these strangers were in the room. But as Mr. Thornton continued reading, the words began to paint a picture that made no sense. To my wife, Elena Johnson, and our children, Sofia and Diego. I felt the room tilt sideways. Wife? Our children? I looked across the table at the younger woman with the 2 kids, and she was staring right back at me with an expression of dawning horror. To my wife, Margaret Johnson. The older woman with the gray hair didn't even flinch. She just nodded slightly, like this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. And to Carlos Martinez, my business partner and friend. The man in the work uniform looked up from his phone, suddenly paying attention. Mr. Thornton kept reading, but the words stopped making sense. Multiple wives, multiple families, business partnerships I'd never heard of, properties in cities I didn't know Robert had ever visited. And then came the part that made everyone in the room turn and stare directly at me. To Monica Johnson, who has been a faithful companion for many years, I leave the sum of $5,000 and my sincere apologies for the pain this revelation will cause. $5,000. Faithful companion. Sincere apologies. Not beloved wife, not mother of my children, not the woman I'd thought I was in Robert's life. Faithful companion. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel every eye in that conference room boring into me like I was some kind of exhibit in a museum of betrayal. I don't understand, I said, and my voice sounded like it was coming from someone else. There's been a mistake. I'm Robert's wife. We've been married 15 years. We have 2 children together. The older woman, Margaret, spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and cold as winter air. I'm Robert's wife. We've been married 22 years. The younger woman, Elena, was crying openly now, her children clinging to her sides. I married Robert 3 years ago, she whispered. These are his children, Sofia and Diego. He said he'd never been married before. The room started spinning. 22 years, 3 years, 15 years. The math didn't make sense, but somehow it made perfect sense. That's impossible, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't impossible. It was just unthinkable. Mr. Thornton cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ladies, I understand this is shocking, but I need to continue with the reading. Robert had been a bigamist, maybe a trigamist. However many wives that made him, he'd been lying to all of us for years, maybe decades. As Mr. Thornton continued reading, the full scope of Robert's deception became clear. The house I thought we owned together was actually in Margaret's name. She was the legal wife, the first wife, the only wife who actually mattered in the eyes of the law. The construction business I thought Robert ran was actually owned by Carlos, the man in the work uniform, who turned out to be Robert's partner, not his employee. The weekend trips that had made me so suspicious weren't business trips at all. They were visits to his other families. Elena lived in Little Rock with their 2 children. Margaret lived in Nashville and apparently had no children with Robert. Carlos lived right here in Memphis and had been covering for Robert's lies for years. The remaining assets, Mr. Thornton continued, including the life insurance policies totaling $200,000, are to be divided equally between Margaret Johnson and Elena Johnson as the legal beneficiaries. Legal beneficiaries. Not me. Not the woman who'd loved him for 15 years, who'd borne his children, who'd believed she was his wife. What about Marcus and Michael? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What about our boys? Mr. Thornton's expression was pained. Miss Johnson, I'm afraid that without legal marriage documentation, your children aren't recognized as beneficiaries under this will. Without legal marriage documentation, because I'd never been legally married to Robert. Because the marriage certificate I'd treasured for 15 years, the wedding I'd thought was the happiest day of my life, the vows we'd exchanged in front of God and our families, none of it was real. I'd been living a lie for 15 years and I'd never known it. After Mr. Thornton finished reading the will, the room erupted into chaos. Elena was sobbing, her children asking in Spanish why Mama was crying. Margaret sat perfectly still, like she'd known this day was coming and had prepared for it. Carlos was arguing with Mr. Thornton about business assets and contracts I'd never heard of. And I sat there in shock, trying to process the fact that the man I'd loved and trusted completely had been living 3 separate lives for years. Did you know Khan? I asked Margaret, the first wife, the real wife. She looked at me with something that might have been pity. I suspected. Robert traveled a lot for work. He was secretive about his phone, his schedule, but I never imagined this. She gestured around the room at the 3 families he'd created. How long have you been married to him? Elena asked through her tears. 22 years, Margaret replied. We married when I was 25. No children. Robert always said he wasn't ready. Meanwhile, he'd been having children with Elena and me, playing father to kids he'd never legally acknowledged as his own. And you? Margaret asked me. 15 years, I said numbly. I thought we were married 15 years ago. We had a ceremony, a reception, a honeymoon. I have a marriage certificate. It's fake, Margaret said matter-of-factly. It has to be. You can't marry someone when you're already married to someone else. The wedding album at home, filled with pictures of what I'd thought was the happiest day of my life. The marriage certificate in our important documents folder. The anniversary cards we'd exchanged every year. All of it fake. All of it lies. What about the house? I asked Mr. Thornton. I live there with my children. We've been paying the mortgage for 10 years. The house is in Margaret's name, he said gently. As the legal spouse, she inherited it along with all other real property. Margaret looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd walked into the room. I don't want to put you and your children on the street, she said. But that house, Robert and I bought it together. It was supposed to be our retirement home. Our retirement home. While I'd been living in it, raising the children he'd had with another woman, believing it was my home, my sanctuary, my family's foundation. Elena wiped her eyes and looked at both of us. He told me he was divorced, she said quietly. Said his first marriage had been a mistake, that he'd learned what real love was when he met me. He proposed on our first anniversary, and we had a beautiful wedding in my parents' church in Little Rock. Another fake wedding. Another woman who'd believed she was building a real marriage with a man who was incapable of honesty. He was going to leave you both, Carlos said suddenly, speaking for the first time since the revelation began. That's what he told me. Said he was going to clean up his mess, choose one family, and be honest for the first time in his adult life. Which family? Margaret asked. I don't know. He died before he could decide. Or maybe he'd never intended to decide. Maybe the heart attack had saved him from having to face the consequences of his lies, leaving us to discover his betrayal after he was safely in the ground. I don't remember driving home from the lawyer's office. I don't remember walking through the front door or sitting down at my kitchen table. But somehow I found myself there, staring at the coffee mug Robert had used that last Thursday morning, still sitting in the sink because I hadn't been able to bring myself to wash it. The boys weren't home yet. They were at my sister Lakeisha's house after school, like they had been every day since the funeral. I was grateful for the silence because I needed to fall apart without witnesses, needed to process the fact that my entire adult life had been built on lies. I pulled out my phone and called Lakeisha, trying to keep my voice steady. Hey, can you keep the boys tonight? I need to handle some things. Of course, honey. You okay? You sound strange. I'll explain later, just hug them for me, okay? After I hung up, I walked through my house, Margaret's house, looking at 15 years of memories with new eyes. The family photos on the mantelpiece, showing Robert with me and the boys at birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. Had he been thinking about his other families when those pictures were taken? Had he been calculating how to balance his time between 3 different lives? The wedding album was in our bedroom closet, right where it had always been. I pulled it out and flipped through pages of lies. Robert in his tuxedo. Me in my grandmother's altered wedding dress. Our families celebrating what they all believed was a sacred union. The minister who'd performed the ceremony. The guests who'd witnessed our vows. The reception where we danced to Here and Now. All of them unknowing participants in an elaborate deception. I found the marriage certificate in the filing cabinet where we kept important documents. It looked so official, so real with its raised seal and formal language. But Margaret was right. It had to be fake. You can't marry someone when you're already married to someone else. That night, I called in sick to work and spent hours going through every document in our house, trying to understand the scope of Robert's deceptions. Bank statements showed regular withdrawals I'd never known about, money that must have been going to support his other families. Credit card bills revealed charges in cities he'd claimed to be visiting for business, but were actually home to Elena and the children he'd had with her. There was a second cell phone hidden in his dresser drawer, one I'd never seen before. When I turned it on, I found text messages that made me physically ill. Can't wait to see you this weekend. The kids miss their daddy. Dinner tonight, I made your favorite. Margaret, Monica's working late so I can talk now. To someone listed as C in his contacts, who I now knew was Carlos. He'd been coordinating his lies through this secret phone, managing 3 different lives like some kind of twisted scheduling system. While I'd been packing his lunches and planning our family vacations, he'd been planning visits to other women who thought they were his only wife. The breaking point came when I found the life insurance policies. Robert had told me he'd increased his life insurance to $100,000 to protect me and the boys. What he'd actually done was take out multiple policies with different companies, listing Margaret and Elena as beneficiaries while leaving me with nothing. I sat on our bedroom floor, Margaret's bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of systematic betrayal, and something shifted inside me. The grief that had been consuming me since Robert's death began transforming into something else. Rage. How dare he? How dare he let me believe I was his wife while he was married to another woman? How dare he have children with me and then refuse to acknowledge them in his will? How dare he die and leave me to discover his lies in front of strangers, humiliated and betrayed in the most public way possible? But more than rage, I felt determination. Marcus and Michael were Robert's biological children, fake marriage certificate or not. They deserved better than the $5,000 he'd left me as an afterthought. They deserved recognition, support, and a father's love, even if that father had proven himself unworthy of their love in return. I called a lawyer the next morning, not Mr. Thornton, who'd clearly been Robert's attorney and had probably known about the multiple wives all along, but a family law attorney my cousin had used during her divorce. "Ms. Williams, I need help," I said when I finally got through to her office. "My husband died and I just discovered that our marriage wasn't legal. But we have 2 children together, and they were left out of his will completely." "Bring me everything," she said after I'd explained the situation. "Birth certificates, paternity tests if you have them, bank records, anything that proves he supported those children financially. Even without a legal marriage, those boys have rights." That afternoon, I went to Marcus and Michael's school and had them tested for DNA comparison. I already knew they were Robert's children. They looked exactly like him, had his laugh, his stubborn streak, his love of basketball. But I needed legal proof, documentation that would hold up in court. I also went to the bank and discovered that Robert had been making regular deposits into a separate account I'd never known about. Money that was clearly meant for Elena and her children. Money that should have been going to support Marcus and Michael instead. The custody and inheritance battle took 8 months, but Ms. Williams had been right. Marcus and Michael had legal rights regardless of my marital status. DNA testing confirmed what I'd always known. Robert was their biological father. Bank records showed he'd been supporting them financially for 12 years. School records, medical records, and witness testimony from neighbors and friends proved he'd been acting as their father in every way that mattered. The court recognizes that while the marriage between Robert Johnson and Monique Johnson was not legally valid, the judge said during our final hearing, the defendant did acknowledge paternity of Marcus and Michael Johnson through his actions, financial support, and public recognition of them as his children. Margaret and Elena were both present for the ruling, and I felt no satisfaction in their obvious disappointment. We were all victims of Robert's lies, all women who trusted a man who was incapable of honesty. The judge awarded Marcus and Michael a portion of Robert's estate equal to what Elena's children had received, $50,000 each from the life insurance policies, plus ongoing support payments from his construction business assets. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to secure their future, to pay for college, to give them the foundation their father should have provided willingly. But the real victory came when Margaret approached me after the hearing. "The house," she said quietly. "I don't want it. Too many memories, and they're not all mine to keep. If you can assume the mortgage, it's yours." I stared at her, not sure I'd heard correctly. "Why?" "Because those boys shouldn't have to lose their home on top of everything else. And because Robert took enough from all of us. He shouldn't take their stability too." Elena overheard and stepped closer to us. "I'm moving back to Mexico," she said. "My parents want to help raise Sofia and Diego, and I can't stay in the house where he lied to me every day." We stood there in the courthouse hallway, 3 women who'd loved the same man, all betrayed by him in different ways, but somehow finding solidarity in our shared devastation. 18 months after Robert's death, I was standing in my kitchen, truly my kitchen now, with the mortgage transferred to my name and the boys' inheritance funding the down payment, making Sunday dinner for a new kind of family. Lakeisha was there with her husband and kids, turning what used to be a quiet meal into the kind of loud, chaotic celebration I remembered from my childhood. Marcus and Michael were helping their cousins set the table, their laughter filling the house in ways it hadn't since before Robert's lies came to light. My neighbor, Mrs. Williams, had stopped by with homemade rolls, staying for dinner like she often did now that she knew I was raising the boys alone. Even Carlos had become a regular visitor, not romantic, but friendly, a man who'd been caught up in Robert's deceptions, but had tried to do right by everyone involved. "How are you doing, Monica?" Mrs. Williams asked as we cleaned up after dinner. "Really doing, I mean." I thought about her question while watching my boys play video games with their cousins, secure in the knowledge that they had a home, a college fund, and a mother who would never lie to them the way their father had lied to me. "I'm free," I said, and meant it. Free from the anxiety I'd carried for months before Robert's death, the sense that something was wrong, but not knowing what. Free from the lies that had poisoned our marriage without me even knowing they existed. Free from the man I'd thought I loved, but who had never really existed. The Robert I'd mourned, the devoted husband and father, the man who'd built our life on honesty and shared dreams, had been a fiction. The real Robert was someone who could compartmentalize his life so completely that he could kiss me goodbye in the morning and spend the weekend with another woman who believed she was his only wife. 6 months later, I received an unexpected visitor. Margaret stood on my front porch holding a cardboard box, looking older and more fragile than she had during the court proceedings. "I've been cleaning out storage units," she said. "I found some things that belong to you and the boys." Inside the box were photo albums I'd never seen before, pictures of Robert from before I'd met him, including his real wedding photos with Margaret. But there were also pictures I recognized. Photos Robert had claimed were lost, including some from Marcus and Michael's early birthdays that had mysteriously disappeared from our own albums. "He kept duplicates of everything," Margaret explained. "Pictures of all his families, stored separately, so none of us would know about the others." At the bottom of the box was a letter addressed to me in Robert's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. "Moniqua," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've learned the truth about my lies. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I'm asking you to believe that everything I felt for you and our boys was real, even though the circumstances weren't." He went on to explain that he'd married Margaret young, before he was ready for the responsibility, and had felt trapped by a relationship that had never been right for either of them. Meeting me had been the first real love I'd ever felt, but he'd been too cowardly to divorce Margaret and too selfish to give me up. "Elena was a mistake born out of loneliness when you were working so much," he wrote, "but her children are beautiful and innocent, just like Marcus and Michael. I couldn't abandon any of you, so I convinced myself I could keep everyone happy by keeping everyone separate. The letter ended with an apology I didn't want, and a promise that meant nothing. I was going to fix everything, Moniqua. I was going to choose you and our boys and build the honest life we deserved. I just ran out of time. I read the letter twice, then threw it away. Robert's explanations didn't matter anymore. His regrets couldn't undo the damage he'd caused. His promises were worth exactly what they'd always been worth. Nothing. That evening, I sat Marcus and Michael down for a conversation I'd been dreading since the day of the will reading. Your father wasn't the man I thought he was, I began carefully. He made choices that hurt a lot of people, including you boys. But that doesn't change the fact that he loved you, and it definitely doesn't change the fact that you're good, strong, honest young men who deserve better than the example he set. Marcus, now 13 and old enough to understand more than I wished he had to, asked the question I'd been preparing for. Did he have other families, Mama? Yes, baby. He did, and that was wrong. Marriage is supposed to be about honesty and commitment, and your father wasn't capable of either. But that's his failure, not ours. Michael, ever the protector, moved closer to me on the couch. Are we going to be okay? We're going to be more than okay, I told him with absolute certainty. We're going to be happy and honest and strong. We're going to build a life based on truth instead of lies. And we have. The boys are thriving in school, playing sports, making friends who come over for sleepovers and birthday parties. They know their father wasn't perfect, but they also know that his failures don't define their worth or their futures. I started dating again last year. Carefully, cautiously, with the kind of skeptical wisdom that comes from having your trust completely shattered and rebuilt from scratch. I don't know if I'll ever marry again, but I know I'll never again mistake charm for character or confuse pretty words with honest actions. The house is truly ours now, filled with memories we're making ourselves instead of lies someone else constructed. Sunday dinners are still loud and chaotic, but they're real in ways they never were when Robert was alive and living a double life. Margaret and I exchange Christmas cards now. Not friends, exactly, but women who understand each other's pain. Elena sends pictures of her children occasionally, and I see Robert in their faces the same way I see him in Marcus and Michael. We're all connected by the same man's betrayal, but we're not defined by it. People ask me sometimes if I miss him, if I wish things had been different. The answer is complicated, because I can't miss someone who never really existed. The Robert I loved was a character he played, not the real man. I miss the life I thought we had, but I don't mourn the loss of the lies. The boys ask about him less now, which probably means they're healing in the way children do. Accepting what was, learning from it, but not letting it poison their ability to trust and love in the future. Last month, Marcus asked me if I thought his father had really loved us, or if that had been fake too. Love isn't just a feeling, I told him, echoing my mother's wisdom from my own childhood. Love is a choice you make over and over again, especially when it's hard. Your father felt something for us, but he never chose us. He never chose anyone completely. And that's the difference between real love and selfish want. I see understanding in my son's eyes, the kind of wisdom that comes from learning hard truths young. It breaks my heart that Marcus and Michael had to learn these lessons so early, but I'm proud of the young men they're becoming, despite their father's failures. Standing in my kitchen now, watching my boys help with dinner preparations the way Robert used to, I realize that his betrayal gave me something I never expected, the strength to know I could survive anything, and the wisdom to recognize real love when it comes my way again. Robert thought he could manage 3 separate lives, keeping everyone happy by keeping everyone separate. What he actually did was teach 4 women and 5 children that we were stronger than his lies, more resilient than his betrayal, and worthy of the honest love he was never capable of giving. Sometimes the worst betrayal becomes the greatest gift. It shows you exactly how strong you are when you stop depending on someone else's lies to hold your world together.